It began with a piece of paper that weighed more than it should have. A single HOA notice, printed in sharp black ink, taped crookedly to the front door, fluttering slightly in the morning breeze like it wanted attention. The house had seen bills, flyers, and junk mail before, but this was different. This notice carried intent, it carried authority, it carried the unmistakable tone of someone who wanted to remind a homeowner exactly who they believed was in control. The neighborhood itself had always looked like a brochure come to life. Identical roofs, carefully measured lawns, mailboxes aligned like soldiers at attention. From the outside, it was calm, orderly, and quiet enough to make outsiders believe nothing ever went wrong there. But beneath that polished surface lived an HOA that treated rules like weapons and power like a personal inheritance. Everyone knew it, even if no one said it out loud. The notice claimed a violation so minor it felt almost insulting. A complaint about property appearance, vague enough to be flexible, strict enough to be threatening. The wording made it clear that this was not a suggestion. It was a demand, wrapped in legal language and sealed with the confidence of someone who assumed compliance was automatic. The deadline was short, the penalty was expensive, and the tone made it clear that resistance would not be tolerated. At first it felt like a mistake. These things happened, at least that's what people liked to believe. A wrong address, a misunderstanding. But the signature at the bottom told a different story. It belonged to a board member whose reputation was already legendary. She was known for walking the neighborhood with a clipboard like it was an extension of her arm. Known for spotting violations no one else could see. Known for enjoying the process a little too much. Ignoring the notice didn't feel like an option, but complying didn't feel right either. The alleged violation didn't exist, at least not in any way that made sense. The property looked the same as it always had, the same as the neighbors, the same as the houses that never seemed to get notices at all. That was when the realization settled in. This wasn't about the rule, it was about the target. Within days, a second notice arrived. This one was firmer, heavier in tone, and far less patient. The language escalated quickly, mentioning fines, enforcement actions, and further consequences. The sense of being watched became unavoidable. Curtains shifted across the street. Cars slowed just a little too much when passing by. The neighborhood that once felt neutral now felt hostile. Word spread quietly at first. One neighbor mentioned receiving something similar months ago. Another admitted they had paid fines just to avoid trouble. A few confessed they had tried to fight back and regretted it. The HOA wasn't just an association anymore. It was a system designed to exhaust people into submission, and it worked. Most of the time, instead of backing down, something unexpected happened. Curiosity turned into investigation. Old emails were reread, HOA bylaws were examined line by line. Patterns emerged that were hard to ignore. The same names kept appearing, the same houses were targeted, the same vague violations were used repeatedly. It started to look less like enforcement and more like selective punishment. The third notice arrived sooner than expected. This one included a fine, not catastrophic, but enough to sting, enough to send a message. It accused the homeowner of ignoring prior warnings, even though evidence suggested otherwise. The confidence in the notice was almost arrogant, as if the outcome had already been decided. That was the moment the situation crossed a line. Paying the fine would have ended it quietly, but it also would have confirmed the HOA's authority. To continue, refusing to pay meant escalation, and escalation meant attention, not just from the board, but from the entire neighborhood. A formal response was submitted, calm and factual, backed with photos, dates, and direct references to the HOA's own rules. It was respectful but firm. It challenged the violation and requested clarification. The response was ignored. Instead, another notice appeared, this one warning of further action if compliance was not immediate. The timeline was impossible. The demands were unreasonable. The intent was clear. The HOA wanted obedience, not discussion. Neighbors began to notice more than just the paperwork. They noticed the way certain board members lingered near the property, the way inspections suddenly became frequent, the way enforcement seemed to follow a pattern of personal interest rather than community standards. Quiet conversations started, happening in driveways and over fences. Then came the meeting notice. A board meeting scheduled with a violation listed on the agenda, attendance encouraged, participation discouraged. It was framed as routine, but everyone knew better. This was a public display, meant to reinforce authority and discourage dissent. The days leading up to the meeting were tense. More letters arrived, each one more aggressive than the last. The fines increased. The language hardened. What started as a single notice had now become a full campaign by the time the meeting date arrived. The issue was no longer about one house. It was about control, fairness, and how far the HOA was willing to go to maintain both. Neighbors who had never spoken up before were paying attention. Some were angry, some were afraid, some were quietly hoping someone else would finally say what they had been thinking for years. As the sun set on the evening before the meeting, the neighborhood felt different. Still quiet, still orderly, but charged with something new. The notice on the door had done more than accuse a violation. It had exposed a system that thrived on silence. And the next day, that silence was about to break. The HOA meeting room was designed to feel official, even intimidated. Neutral walls, folding chairs arranged in neat rows, a long table at the front where board members sat elevated just enough to establish hierarchy. It wasn't a courtroom. Would it borrow the same psychology? Speak when spoken to. Sit where you're told. Accept the outcome. Attendance at night was higher than usual. Far higher. Homeowners filled the chairs, lined the walls, and stood near the back. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of frustration. A few came because they recognized their own experiences in the situation being discussed. The board members noticed immediately. The meeting followed its usual script at first. Routine updates, budget discussions, minor complaints. Then the agenda item appeared, and the room shifted. The violation was read aloud, stripped of context, framed as clear-cut non-compliance. The tone suggested the outcome was already decided. What the board didn't expect was resistance that came prepared. Documentation was presented calmly and methodically. Photos contradicted the violation. Dates exposed inconsistencies. Sections of the HOA bylaws were cited directly, highlighting how the enforcement didn't align with the rules themselves. The atmosphere changed. Murmurs spread. Heads nodded. The board member most associated with the violation responded with visible irritation, attempting to reassert authority through repetition rather than substance. But the room was no longer passive. Questions began to surface, not just about this case, but about others. Similar fines, similar notices, similar patterns. One homeowner shared their experience, then another. Stories overlapped. Selective enforcement became undeniable. What had been treated as isolated incidents now looked like a trend. The HOA's credibility began to crack in real time. The board attempted to regain control by limiting discussion, but the effort only intensified the tension. The more they tried to silence the room, the more unified the homeowners became. This was no longer about one violation. It was about years of unchecked power. By the end of the meeting, the board announced that the violation would be reviewed. Further, it was framed as generosity, but everyone understood it as a retreat. The room emptied slowly, conversation spilling into the parking lot. Something had shifted, and it couldn't be undone. Over the following weeks, the fallout was immediate. Notices stopped appearing. Fines were quietly withdrawn. Emails went unanswered. The HOA's usual confidence was replaced by caution. But the neighborhood wasn't satisfied with silence anymore. A group of homeowners began meeting independently, sharing documents and comparing experiences. They reviewed election rules, term limits, and financial records. What they found raised more questions than answers. Attendance at HOA meetings increased. So did scrutiny. Eventually, a formal request was submitted for an audit and a re-evaluation of enforcement practices. This time, it came with signatures, lots of them. The HOA couldn't ignore it without exposing itself further. Under pressure, the board announced upcoming changes. Committees were formed, policies were clarified. A few familiar faces quietly stepped down, citing personal reasons. New volunteers stepped forward, motivated by transparency rather than control. The neighborhood began to feel different again, but not the way it had before. The calm was no longer enforced. It was chosen. People spoke more openly. Notices were questioned. Rules were applied consistently or not at all. The original violation was eventually dismissed entirely, with no apology and no explanation. But it didn't matter anymore. The damage had already been done to the HOA's authority, and the community had reclaimed something it didn't realize it had lost. All of it had started with a single piece of paper on a front door. A notice meant to intimidate, a notice meant to silence. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had reminded an entire neighborhood that power only works when no one challenges it, and once challenged, it rarely survives unchanged.